One of the important concepts to understand with quantifications is how to recognize whether or not a variable in a quantification or outside of a quantification is free or bound. So some semantics to get out of the way before we get started. In generalized theorems and axioms about quantifications, you might see a star or an asterisk like this right here. The asterisk just represents any quantifier. So that could be like a summation, the universal quantifier, the existential quantifier, or and operations, basically just any type of quantifier. And this is just acting as a placeholder to tell you that whatever theorem or axiom is being shared applies to basically any quantifier. So it's just a placeholder. Also, the variable that is right next to the quantifier, whatever appears here immediately adjacent to the quantifier, is an individual variable or a list of variables called dummies or dummy variables. And these are always going to appear right next to the quantifier in your expression, and these variables are locally scoped to the quantification. This basically means that they only have meaning inside the quantification. So here you can see this light orange x is actually different from this dark orange x, and we'll explain more about that momentarily. So in this example, the x that is right here is one variable x. It is instantiated right here next to this universal quantifier, and everything within the quantification, so everything inside these brackets, is within the quantification, and every time you see an x inside the quantification, just because we've instantiated it right here like this, every time the variable x appears somewhere else within these brackets, it's going to actually be referring to this variable x back here. So really what we would say is all of these occurrences of x are bound to this dummy variable x, which we instantiated next to the quantifier. In contrast to that, the x that we have out here is outside of the brackets. It's outside of the scope of the quantification. So this x, we would say, is free, because when we refer to the x that's out here, it's a different x from the one that we instantiated next to the quantifier. If you code, this is very similar to the idea of a variable that is local to a function in programming. If you were to instantiate some variable x inside some function, so here this x right here is like our variable within the function, and our quantification, is like the function. If you were to instantiate some variable x inside the function and then try to reference it outside of the function, so if you tried to call this x somewhere out here, your program might give you an error saying that it's out of scope or it's unable to find the variable. And that's because x was local to your function. However, what you could do is create some x inside your function and then create some other x outside of your function. And when you call on the x that's in the function, you're calling on a totally different variable from the one that's outside of the function. So all of this really to say that the x you instantiate over here is different from the x that you use outside of it. Whenever you create some dummy variable within the boundaries of a quantification, and all that really means is within these brackets, it is one variable, and you can create other variables with the same name outside of it, somewhere external to that quantification. Any x that appears inside the quantification is going to be bound to the one that you instantiated, and any x that appears outside of it will occur freely as long as it is not instantiated next to a quantifier, like so. All right, so here's an informal way to basically walk yourself through some steps to determine whether or not a variable of interest is free or bound in a certain expression. So the first thing that you need to ask yourself is whether or not it's inside a quantification. If it's not inside a quantification, it is probably free. If it is inside the quantification, then you need to proceed to ask yourself whether or not it appears directly next to the quantifier. So something like this. If the answer is yes, then it means that your variable is a dummy variable, and any occurrences of that variable inside the quantification are going to be bound to the dummy variable. Otherwise, it is probably free. So if we go back to that example from earlier, we can take a look at this and identify, okay, this right here is our quantification, and everything over here is outside of our quantification. So let's take a look at the variable x, and let's determine whether or not x is free or bound. So looking inside the quantification, This x is inside the quantification, which means that we need to move on to ask ourselves this step. Does it appear directly next to the quantifier? Yes, there's an x here and there's an x here, but there's also an x here that's right next to the quantifier. And what that means, according to our rules here, is that this x must be a dummy variable, and any occurrences of x inside the quantification are bound to the dummy variable. That means that this occurrence of x is bound to this dummy variable x, and this occurrence of x is bound to this dummy variable x. Now, what if we wanted to ask ourselves about this occurrence of x out here? Well, the first thing that we can ask ourselves is it in a quantification? And right away, we can see that the answer is no. So it is probably free. And if we wanted to just verify this for ourselves, we can use this general rule of thumb here, which is that it's going to be bound if it's attached to a quantifier and free otherwise. If we take a look at this x out here, it's not attached to any quantifier. The x that is over here, again, is instantiating its own local x that is local to the scope of this quantification, which means that this is actually an entirely new x, and it's not attached to any quantifier, which means that it is free. So we can formalize the previous steps in a proper definition for whether or not a variable is free or bound. So we would say in general for some I, if I is free in some expression E, then it is also free in these two expressions, so long as I is not one of the dummy variables in list X. So what that really means is, okay, we've got some I, we've got some expression E. We're assuming the expression E contains I. Okay, so E is some expression that contains I. It might not contain I, but basically as long as I occurs free within E, it's easier to think of it like an expression that contains I, then we're going to be guaranteed that if E is the range of your quantification, and there's some I in here and it occurs free, and it's not also in this list, then it's free in your quantification. And if it's also in sort of the proposition over here, then it occurs free in your expression so long as it's not in the list X. And going back to the previous rule to make it a bit less convoluted, all it means is I showing up in this list? If it is, it's probably bound. If it's not, then it's probably free. And another good rule of thumb is that the occurrence of I in the expression I is always free. It's always free. So a variable always occurs free within itself. So let's say we had some expression E, and let's call this expression E, and let's say E is equal to I. So that's our expression. So E is some expression that contains I, and within this expression, based on the fact that a variable always occurs free within itself, we know that I occurs free in E, because E is just I, and I must occur free within itself. So let's say we had some quantification that looked like this. We got some quantifier, X, and then we have E and F like this. And we know that E is equal to I, so really what this is some quantifier with X, and you have I as your range, like so. So we can take a look at this and say, well, okay, we have this I is occurring free in E, so we've satisfied the conditions to be using this check. And now we're going to ask ourselves, okay, is I one of the dummy variables in list X? Well, here, the list X is really just X, and I is not X. So it doesn't appear next to the quantifier, which means that I, right here, this occurrence of I, is free within this quantification. So the kind of contrary to this rule is also something that we touched on earlier. If we have some I and it occurs free in E, then we would say that I is bound to the dummy variable I in these two expressions, which are the same expressions that appeared up here, so long as I is one of the dummy variables in list X. So all this means is that if you have kind of the same situation you had earlier, the same situation we had up here, let's say we have some expression E and E is I. Well, I occurs free with an I, so I is occurring free in E. Let's say we make our quantification the same way we did before, just like this, except now X is not X. Let's say it's I. So now we have I appearing next to the quantifier over here, which means that I is one of the dummy variables in our list X. And what this means is that since I is appearing directly next to the quantifier within our quantification, this occurrence of I is bound to our dummy variable I. So the I right here, this is our dummy variable I, and this is just some occurrence of I in the quantification, but now this I is bound to this dummy variable I that we've instantiated over here. So this is just a formal way to kind of illustrate what we talked about previously. All right, so let's go through some examples. So taking a look at this quantification, we can first start by breaking it into steps. We know that this over here is our expression with our quantifier. We know that this over here is our range, and this is our proposition. So taking a look at this, we're going to try to identify our dummy variables. So we know that the dummy variables are always going to appear directly adjacent to the quantifier in the left-hand side of our quantification. Over here, we can spot our quantifier as this addition sign right here, which means that x is our dummy variable. So we've identified our dummy variable as x. So let's take a look at all of the other variables that appear in here, and let's try to determine whether or not they're free or bound. So let's think about x, and let's think about y. Specifically, let's take a look at this occurrence of x right here and this occurrence of y right here. So taking a look at this occurrence of x, let's ask ourselves some questions. So the first thing to ask is whether or not this appears inside a quantification. And indeed, we are inside a quantification. So we can't immediately jump to the conclusion that this is free. What we need to do now is ask ourselves whether or not this same variable x appears next to a quantifier within our quantification. Now, we just took a look at our dummy variable over here, and we identified that this x right here is our dummy variable. We have an x appearing right next to a quantifier in our expression. And that means that this x is our dummy variable, and that all other occurrences of x inside the quantification are going to be bound to this dummy variable x. And that's exactly what we have happening here. That means that this x right here is going to be bound to the dummy variable x, which means that our variable x is bound to the dummy variable x that we instantiate over here. Now let's take a look at y. So we have our variable y over here. The first thing that we want to ask ourselves is, are we inside a quantification? The answer to that is still yes. We are still operating within the brackets of this quantification. So now what we want to ask ourselves is, does this variable appear next to a quantifier anywhere in this expression? Well, we know the only quantifier in the expression is this plus sign over here, and the only variable that appears directly adjacent to it is our dummy variable, x. So y is not a dummy variable in our expression, which means that y is occurring free inside our quantification, and that is because it does not appear directly next to a quantifier anywhere in here, so it's not bound to any dummy variable. So we can conclude that y is free. All right, so let's take a look at this example here. So the first thing that we can do, again, is to break up the pieces of our quantification to identify important parts. Here on the left-hand side, we have our quantifier, the universal quantifier, and our variable that appears right next to it. Right here, we have the range of our quantification, and here we have our proposition. So knowing this breakdown, we can now start to take a look at the different variables. So the only variable that appears here is I, so let's try to deduce whether or not I is free or bound. So taking a look at this here, we know this is our quantifier right here, our universal quantifier right there, and we can see that the variable I appears directly adjacent to this quantifier. That means that I is our dummy variable. I is our dummy variable. So taking a look at the other occurrences of I, let's think about whether or not they are free or bound. So we have one occurrence here and one occurrence here. So this one is kind of occurring as an array index, and this is just a part of our range like we've seen before. So taking a look at this here, we have the variable I. The first thing we want to ask ourselves is, are we inside a quantification? And the answer to that is yes, we are operating within the bounds of this quantification. So now we need to ask ourselves, okay, does this I appear next to a quantifier? And the answer to that question is what we took a look at the beginning. The I over here appears directly next to the quantifier in our expression, meaning that this I is a dummy variable, and all other occurrences of I within the quantification are going to be bound to the dummy variable I. That means that this I is bound to the dummy variable I, and in addition to that, we can also conclude that this I over here is bound to the dummy variable I. That means that all occurrences of I are bound within this expression. All right, so let's take a look at a bit more of a complicated example here. So in here, we actually have two separate quantifications. So this right here is our first quantification, and we're adding it on to this over here, which is our second quantification. As you can see, we have two different quantifiers. Over here, we have the universal quantifier, and over here, we have the existential quantifier. So we can get started on breaking down these quantifications. Hopefully you have been able to identify these pieces here as the sort of quantifier and dummy variable group in our quantifications. These pieces here as the range of our quantifications, and these pieces here as the propositions. So we can start by analyzing these quantifications one at a time. So let's take a look at the first one, and then we can move on to the second one. So in the first quantification over here, we have our universal quantifier, and next to that, we have the variable I appearing. Since this variable I appears directly adjacent to the universal quantifier, we know that this variable I is a dummy variable. And what that means for the rest of the expression is that if we see an I anywhere else inside this quantification, we know that it's going to be bound to this dummy variable I. So if we take a look at our other occurrences of I, we can start with this one right here. So we ask ourselves, are we in a quantification? The answer is yes, we are within this first quantification. Now we ask ourselves, does I appear next to a quantifier? And we just figured that out earlier. I appears right next to the universal quantifier, which means that I is a dummy variable, and all other occurrences of I within the expression are going to be bound to dummy variable I. So that means that this I is bound to dummy variable I, and by a very similar process, we can deduce that this I is also bound to dummy variable I, very similarly to the last example. So in our first quantification, we can deduce that I is bound to the dummy variable I. Now let's take a look at the second quantification. Over here we have our existential quantifier, and immediately adjacent to the existential quantifier, we have a dummy variable I. We know this is our dummy variable because it appears right next to the quantifier. Now, let's take a moment to notice the fact that we have an I appearing over here and an I appearing over here. In reality, though, this I is a completely different I from this one. Every time we make a new sort of dummy variable and quantifier pair, we're instantiating a new variable. And recall that as soon as we exit the first quantification, as soon as we leave this quantification and enter this one, we are out of scope of the first quantification. This I is locally scoped to quantification 1, just as this I is locally scoped to quantification 2. So these two quantifications, while they both deal with a variable I, are actually dealing with two completely different I's. This would be like creating two separate functions in a program and creating some variable I within each of them, such that each I is locally scoped to each function. When you access I in one function, it's different from accessing the I in the other function. So we can continue our analysis of the second quantification over here. Let's take a look at this I right here. We ask ourselves, are we in a quantification? The answer is yes. Now we ask ourselves, does this I appear directly adjacent to a quantifier anywhere in this expression? The answer is again yes. We identify this I as our dummy variable as it appears directly next to the existential quantifier. That means that I is a dummy variable, and as a result, all occurrences of I within this quantification are going to be bound to this dummy variable I, which means that this occurrence and this occurrence, likewise, are bound within this expression. So in this expression, I is also bound. So to be perfectly explicit about this, this I and this I are bound to this dummy variable I, and separately, this I and this I are bound to this dummy variable I. So there are two different I's at play, but in both cases, all occurrences of I within either expression are bound to their respective dummy variables. Okay, let's take a look at this example over here. So here we kind of have like a nested quantification. So this up here is one big quantification, and this in here is a smaller one. The smaller quantification in this expression is acting like the proposition, although it really is a predicate in this case, on the right-hand side of our big quantification. This over here is our range, and this over here is the pair of the quantifier and the dummy variable. So let's take a look at how we can analyze this and determine whether or not these variables are free or bound. We're going to take a look at the two variables that appear here, which are I and j. So we can start by taking a look at our quantifiers. Where do we see quantifiers? Well, we have two instances of the universal quantifier. The first one appears over here, the next one appears over here. So if we take a look at this first instance of the universal quantifier, we can see that we have our variable I appearing right next to it, which means that I is a dummy variable. And over here we have our variable j appearing next to it, which means that j is also a dummy variable. So let's take a look at some occurrences of different variables. Let's take a look at this occurrence of I right here. The first question that we want to ask ourselves is, does I appear within a quantification? Yes, I appears within this massive quantification over here. So now we want to ask ourselves, does I appear directly next to any quantifiers? And the answer to that is yes. We already identified that over here. This means that I is a dummy variable, which means that all occurrences of I within the scope of the quantification are going to be bound to dummy variable I. In this case, the quantification is quite large, but all occurrences of I within this entire scope would be bound to this dummy variable. In this case, what that means for our occurrence of I right here is that this I is actually bound to that dummy variable I. So that occurrence of I is bound. Now let's take a look at J. Let's take a look at this occurrence of J right here. We first ask ourselves, is J within a quantification? In this case, it's actually within two. We're within this smaller quantification right here, and we're within this larger quantification right here. So the answer to that question is yes, J is within a quantification. Now we need to ask ourselves, does J appear next to a quantifier? Well, we identified that at the beginning. We have our j over here appearing right next to our universal quantifier, which means that j is a dummy variable, and that means that all occurrences of j within the quantification are going to be bound to dummy variable j. All that means is all occurrences of j within the scope of this small quantification are going to be bound to dummy variable j. So that means this instance of j and this instance of j are both bound to the dummy variable j that is instantiated over here, which means that these occurrences of j are also bound. All right, so for the last example, we can look at something relatively large and complicated, like this expression here. So let's take a look at all of the different occurrences of I and of j, and let's try to determine whether or not they are free or bound. So we can just go left to right. So let's start by taking a look at this I over here. We can ask ourselves, based on our set of rules from before, is this within a quantification? And the answer is immediately no. We know that this I isn't bound within a quantification. It doesn't appear next to any quantifiers, and so we can say that this occurrence of I is free. So this specific occurrence of I is free. Similarly, we can take a look at J. We can ask ourselves, does this appear within a quantification? And the answer to that question is no. It's not within a quantification, it doesn't appear next to a quantifier, and so we can say that this occurrence of J is free. So now let's take a look at the first quantification over here. We can identify sort of the three pieces of our quantification like so, and then we can get started on analyzing it. So we see that we have our quantifier here, the summation, appearing on the far left, and immediately next to our quantifier, we have the variable I. What this means is that variable I is a dummy variable. So now we can take a look at the occurrences of other variables within this expression. Let's start by taking a look at this occurrence of I. We want to ask ourselves, is this within a quantification? The answer is yes, it is within this quantification here. Now we want to ask ourselves, does I appear directly next to a quantifier? The answer is yes. As we identified before, it's appearing directly next to our summation quantifier, and so that means I is a dummy variable, and all occurrences of I within the scope of the quantification are going to be bound to dummy variable I. That means that this I is bound to dummy variable I, and similarly, it means that this I right here is bound to dummy variable I. Now, in this expression, we also see a j as an exponent up here. So we can ask ourselves, does this appear within a quantification? The answer is yes. J is appearing within the scope of this quantification. Now we want to ask ourselves, does J appear directly next to a quantifier anywhere? J does not appear directly next to a quantifier anywhere. Frankly, it doesn't appear anywhere else within this expression. But the important part is that it's not showing up over here. And what that means is that J is not a dummy variable. And that means that this occurrence of J is free because it is not bound to any dummy variable J. So moving on to the next quantification, we can take a look at this over here. Again, we have kind of a nested quantification happening, very similarly to the previous example. So let's start by taking a look at the larger external quantification. So here we have our summation quantifier, and immediately adjacent to that, we have the variable I. What that means, just like the previous one, is that variable I is a dummy variable. So let's take a look at this first occurrence of I. We first ask ourselves, is this within a quantification? The answer is yes. We are within the scope of this larger quantification. So now we want to ask ourselves, does I appear directly next to a quantifier? And as we identified at the beginning, we know yes, it does. And that means that I is a dummy variable, and that means that all of the occurrences of I within the scope of the quantification are going to be bound to the dummy variable I. That means this I is going to be bound to dummy variable I, and similarly, it means that this I is going to be bound to dummy variable I. Remember that even though this is a separate quantification, it still exists within the scope of the larger quantification. And as a result, the occurrence of I that appears within this smaller quantification is actually still tethered to this dummy variable I we instantiated over here. So just keep that in mind if you see a nested quantification type situation. So let's take a look at the smaller quantification. So here we have our summation quantifier just like before, and immediately adjacent to it we have the variable j. What that means is that j is a dummy variable. So let's take a look at this first occurrence of j. We want to ask ourselves, is this inside a quantification? And similarly to example 4, yes, it's actually inside 2. It's inside the smaller one, and it's inside the larger one. So now we want to ask ourselves, does J appear directly adjacent to any quantifier? And the answer to that is yes. J appears directly next to a quantifier, which means that J is a dummy variable. And so this occurrence of J is bound to dummy variable J. And similarly, this occurrence of J is bound to dummy variable J. And as I know this I might be a little bit confusing, I'll walk through the specific steps we could go through looking at it to determine whether or not it's free or bound. So we would take a look at this I. We would say, okay, is it within a quantification? The answer, just like with J, is yes. It's actually within two quantifications, the smaller one and the larger one. Now we ask ourselves, does I appear directly next to a quantifier, anywhere within its scope? And the answer to that question would be yes. We have I here, and we know that I appears directly next to the quantifier in the larger external quantification that contains this I. And as a result, we would end up concluding similarly that this I is actually bound to dummy variable I. So in summary, the leftmost occurrence of I is free. The leftmost occurrence of J is free. The occurrence of J as an exponent is free. And all other occurrences of I and J within this expression are bound either to dummy variable I or J, respectively. And to drive this point home from earlier, the I that is over here is different from the I that is over here because they are instantiated separately.